Good evening, everyone. I'm Anthony Squires, aka Dr. Antonio, and today I'd like to share with you a little research that I've been doing on the German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht, and especially his relationship to the philosophical tradition of Marxism. By the middle of the 1920s, Brecht, who was still in his 20s, had established himself as a significant figure in German theater with plays such as Drums in the Night and Ball. These works expressed general discontentment with the social economic realities of the day and even explored class-based conflict. In this way, Brecht's early writings are marked by proto-Marxist tendencies which subsequently developed into overtly Marxist sentiments when, in 1926, he discovered Lenin and Marx for the first time. Brecht later reflected that, quote, "It was only when I read Lenin's State and Revolution and then Marx's Capital that I understood philosophically where I stood," end quote. It was as if, quote, "Marx was the only spectator for my plays I'd ever come across." Because Brecht was a prominent Marxist, he was forced to flee Nazi Germany in 1933, and he remained in exile until 1948, repatriating to East Berlin in the newly formed Socialist German Democratic Republic. This exile period was financially and emotionally difficult for Brecht. Nevertheless, he never lost his faith in nor commitment to Marxism. Marxism provided Brecht with two things: an analytical framework for understanding the social world and a purpose for his artistic expression. The analytical framework was dialectical materialism, Marx's theory of history positing that history moves predictably as successions of contradictions manifested as class-based social antagonisms work themselves out. Dialectics, according to Brecht, quote, has always been a property of nature, only discovered by Hegel and Marx. Before this discovery, the world could not be explained, end quote. Dialectic served as the interpretive basis for social reality for Brecht and guided his approach to writing. Quote, "Plays, especially with historical content," he argued, "cannot be written intelligibly in any other framework." Brecht was particularly cognizant of the significance Hegel's dialectics played on Marx and Lenin's thought, arguing that Hegel provided them, and subsequently himself, with a philosophical method of inestimable value. Indeed, Brecht believed that any artist interested in producing realist art must understand Hegel's dictum that truth is concrete. Marxism also offered Brecht a clear purpose for his art. Brecht adopted Marx's view that history was moving towards communism. However, before that would happen, certain conditions had to be met. Specifically, the proletarian class had to become class conscious and recognize its economically exploited position within society. Brecht believed that he could help make that happen through his art, specifically through one of the defining characteristics of his epic theater, distancing or estrangement effects, which were meant to produce a critical detachment between a spectator and the events portrayed so that the spectator could no longer resort to accustomed ways of understanding and interpreting the world. In sum, the purpose of Brecht's epic theater was to act as a revolutionary Marxist aesthetic, comprising a series of experiments in disrupting and eradicating the old consciousness so that a new one could emerge to help bring about the advent of communism. Marxism is clearly a principal element of Brecht's literary and theoretical work. His presence in Marxist studies, however, has remained something of a contradiction. His name frequently comes up, yet at the same time he remains conspicuously absent, seen mostly in fleeting glimpses lurking behind more familiar shoulders. Therefore, this talk sketches out Brecht's relationship to Marxism along three dimensions: Brecht's Marxist influences, Marxist reactions to Brecht, and Brecht's influences on Marxism. It shows that not only was his work heavily influenced by the movement, his thought also occupies an often unrecognized central position within it. Marx and Lenin were instrumental to Brecht's thought. The dialectical materialism both served as the basis for Brecht's understanding of the social world and history. Moreover, he believed that dialectical materialism could serve as the basis of a scientifically founded cultural critique. Weary of non-objective social criticism which tended toward what he called the culinary, that is, treated art as a product to be consumed solely for the audience's pleasure, Brecht looked to dialectical materialism to act as a methodological foundation of a, quote, criticism of criticisms, end quote, adding an empirical dimension which was, quote, remote from matters of taste and individualism. Additionally, Marx's Capital served as a basis for Brecht's understanding of the functions and consequences of market capitalism, something he strove to depict simply and accurately in many of his works, including The Threepenny Opera, St. Joan of the Stockyards, and Mother Courage. Lenin's influence on Brecht is perhaps best revealed in his Miti, a fragmented series of parables and aphorisms. In it, Lenin is presented as a pillar of philosophical practicality, one of the central themes of the text. For example, using a sinicized pseudonym for Lenin, Brecht states, "Mianli's practice proved that he was a great philosopher. Mianli's philosophy was practical, and his practice philosophical." In Miti, Brecht also adapts Lenin's parable on ascending a high mountain to make a philosophical point. In brief, the idea is that a mountain climber theorizes about the best way to proceed upward, but as he climbs, he may have to change his approach given the material realities with which he is confronted. Furthermore, Brecht shows admiration for Lenin's ability to, quote, seek out the contradiction in appearances that seem unified, end quote, which, according to Brecht, quote, can lead to good solutions, end quote. While Brecht was also impacted by Marxist thinkers such as Mao, whose On Contradiction Brecht used as a teaching aid for his adaptation of Shakespeare's Coriolanus, Brecht considered the philosopher Karl Krosch and the sociologist Fritz Sternberg his primary teachers. Brecht attended Marxist discussion groups and lectures led by these men who were, at the time, influential writers and public intellectuals. Gatherings such as these were typical features in Berlin during the Weimar Republic and had a considerable impact on Brecht's intellectual development. In them, he was introduced to Marxist concepts, began to engage with them critically, and he was able to associate with like-minded individuals. With regard to Sternberg, Brecht was sympathetic to his idea that the primary role of an artist in a socialist revolution was to be, quote, the articulator of the proletarian class consciousness, end quote, and of the, quote, historical necessity, end quote, of doing away with the conventional artistic forms in order to make conscious the, quote, already existing reality of social relations. Brecht also happened to be with Sternberg in Sternberg's Berlin apartment on May 1, 1929, across from the Karl Liebknecht House, the headquarters of the Communist Party of Germany. The two watched from Sternberg's window as police massacred protesting communists on the street below. Sternberg later reflected that witnessing this event drove Brecht closer to communism. Brecht also found Krosch's ideas compelling. Both fled Germany in February of 1933, avoiding the Nazi crackdown of communists after the Reichstag fire. Krosch and Brecht maintained close ties during the war, and Krosch even came to Denmark to visit the exiled Brecht family. Brecht shared Krosch's anti-Stalinism, a stance that's reflected in his Miti. However, he has been criticized by some, including Hannah Arendt, for not being more vocal in his opposition to Stalin. The two key areas of philosophical overlap between Koch and Brecht are their emphasis on making material interventions designed to change the world and the need for historicizing, or, quote, judging a particular social system from another social system's point of view, end quote, so that events are seen, quote, in historically relative terms, in order to keep their impermanence always before our eyes, so that our own period can be seen as impermanent too, end quote. Koch's material intervention can be found in his promotion of workers' councils, and Brecht's interventions can be found in his art. These they considered to be two fronts on the same battle. As I will explain shortly, Brecht has been embraced by many Marxist theorists. However, his relationship with some Marxist contemporaries was more complicated. He was often viewed as a useful ally, but viewed skeptically, in part because he never joined the Communist Party, a fact that he attested to truthfully while being interrogated by the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, and in part because his aesthetic theories conflicted with established party orthodoxy. Lukács, for example, was critical of Brecht's idea that a revolutionary aesthetic calls for the destruction of existing artistic forms because they merely reflect the ideological proclivities of the ruling class. By contrast, and in accordance with the position of the Soviet Communist Party, Lukács believed that established artistic forms represent the history of previously reconciled social contradictions and therefore serve as the proper literary form for revolutionary advancement. Not all criticism of Brecht was rooted in his rejection of party orthodoxy, however. Critical theorist Theodor Adorno expressed concern that Brecht's influence was negatively impacting his friend Walter Benjamin's work. He thought Brecht's understanding of dialectical materialism was too simple, lacking comprehension of the intricate interplay between politics and culture. Adorno argued that Brecht's works, and indeed all politically committed art, that is, art that tries to, quote, change fundamental attitudes, end quote, fails to be truly progressive because it does not, quote, awaken the free choice of spectators and instead aims at a supreme effect, end quote, attempting to negate contradictory ideas totally instead of making itself available to reconciliation in a dialectic of enlightenment. Adorno's position, however, was not shared by his Frankfurt School friend and associate cultural theorist Benjamin, and Brecht, for his part, was equally dismissive of figures like Adorno and others at the Frankfurt School. Their thinking, he believed, was not oriented toward practical action and thus lacked utility and purpose. Brecht pejoratively referred to such thinkers as TUI, an inverted acronym for intellectuals. Brecht's contributions to 20th century Marxism are numerous and notable. Perhaps his greatest impact was on Benjamin, an intimate friend of Brecht's who engaged closely with this thought, commenting on it in a series of articles. Benjamin also visited Brecht while the latter was in exile in Denmark. There, the two were frequently found discussing politics and culture over chess matches and cigars. Through his association with Brecht, Benjamin was able to juxtapose his thought with the radical alternative Brecht represented, allowing him to explore alternative ideas and positions which sharpened his thinking. Moreover, Brecht's advocacy of dialectical materialism, according to Adorno, instilled in Benjamin, quote, the hope of an empowered, collectively legitimized form of discourse, end quote. Lastly, Benjamin saw Brecht's aesthetics as having the potential to form the basis for a liberating cultural critique because its form called attention to particular representations of the social world and forced the spectator to call into question the cultural system of which those representations are a part. In Benjamin's words, Brecht's epic theater fosters, quote, a lively and productive consciousness. This consciousness enables it to treat elements of reality as though it were setting up an experiment with the conditions at the end of the experiment, not at the beginning. Similarly, other important Marxist philosophers and cultural critics have viewed Brecht's aesthetics favorably, seeing in them a way past serious problems of cultural representation. This is especially true in French Marxism. Althusser, for example, like Benjamin, was interested in the effects Brecht's aesthetics had on consciousness, believing that the disjointed plot structure characteristic of his epic theater was, quote, the basis for a true critique of the illusions of consciousness, end quote. According to Althusser, quote, Brecht overthrew the problematic of the classical theater by maintaining a consciousness of self, end quote, in his works that excluded, quote, any pretensions to exhaustive self-recovery and self-representation, end quote. In this respect, according to Althusser, Brecht's plays resisted bourgeois ideological consciousness, presenting the opportunity for the, quote, radical discovery of what is other than itself. Barth, too, was interested in Brecht because of the implications his aesthetics had for semiotics. He states, quote, Brecht divined the variety and relativity of semantic systems and was able to show the world as an object to be deciphered, end quote. The point of semiotics for Barth is to understand how human action shapes reality and that our reality is not independent of ourselves but a product of our historically determined mental representations of the world. While Barth believed that traditional literature was plagued by a, quote, voluntary acceptance of myth, end quote, he did not think that this was the case with Brecht. Quote, Brecht alone, perhaps, he asserted, has glimpsed the necessity for socialist art of always taking man on the eve of revolution, that is to say, alone, still blind, on the point of having his eyes opened to the revolutionary light by the natural excess of his wretchedness. Barth's understanding of Brecht is not far from that of Sartre. According to Sartre, Brecht's aim is, quote, to show modern man to us through gestures presenting action, making us discover ourselves as others, achieving an objectivity which I cannot get from my reflection, end quote. For Sartre, Brecht forces us to become self-reflective anthropologists, and thus the audience, quote, recognizes itself but in a strange guise, as if it were someone else. It brings itself into being as an object before its own eyes, and it sees itself, though, without playing itself as a role, and thus comes to understand itself. Although Jacques Rancière is not convinced that Brecht's aesthetics have lived up to the emancipatory promise his compatriots saw in it a generation earlier, the questions that Brecht proposes serve as a jumping-off point for his discussion of emancipatory aesthetics. Moreover, other left-leaning literary interpreters have been attracted to Brecht because of his focus on emancipatory aesthetics. Frederick Jameson, for example, provides an analysis of the relationship between Brecht's form and his politics, synthesizing Brecht's ideas in Marxist terms and concluding that Brecht's standalone episodic scenes can be used as a critical framework for literary and cultural interpretation because they foster in the spectator a new way of seeing. Additionally, Darko Suvin frames Brecht's work as a Marxist emancipatory literary project and emphasizes that the world is a material relationship determining the conditions under which we live, but into which we can intervene to bring about change. It is precisely this aspect of intervention that Wolfgang Fitzhaug, in his seminal foray into the philosophical Brecht, treats as the cornerstone of Brecht's thought. In it, Brecht is positioned as a central figure in the Marxist tradition of praxis philosophy, which argues that people's action can move history forward, thus changing our material realities. Building on insights from Brecht and coupling them with those of Antonio Gramsci, Haug developed his own philosophy of critical reflection and action. Finally, one would be remiss not to mention Brecht's enormous impact on subsequent Marxist theater practitioners who, like him, sought to change the world. As we can see from this brief discussion, Marxism is an essential component to Brecht's thought and theatrical work. While not embraced by all Marxists, his ideas influenced many and demanded critical engagement from his critics. The fact that so many Marxist thinkers wrestled with Brecht's thought and continued to do so attests to its centrality and significance. He remains important because he is unique in the degree to which he developed a theoretically conscious aesthetic around the goal of socialist revolution and integrated Marxist thought and dialectical thinking into his artistic productions. Although he has not often been the focal point of studies within 20th century Marxism, he nevertheless played a key role in its development and was especially influential in framing its aesthetic debates. Thank you.